Hello, everybody, and welcome to Parrot Analytics Live. My name is Samuel, and I'm the VP of Marketing here at Parrot Analytics. To get started, I would like to extend a special welcome to all of our Demand 360 enterprise customers. Thank you all for making the time once again to be with us here today. As we wait for the room to fill, if you like, please write in the chat where you're joining from. I think it'd be super interesting to see all the countries represented here today. Before you do, make sure you change the default to everyone. I think it's just set to how hosts and panelists. So just swap that over to everyone, and that would be fun to see. Our topic here today is how global sporting events influence demand, which will be presented by Maximo, one of our partner insights directors. Maximo has many interesting insights to share from the sporting world, and I can't wait to get into today's webinar. Sao Paulo in Spain, welcome. Just a couple of admin things before we get started. We've received all the questions that you've already submitted. Thank you for those, and we will address those at the end of the webinar. I'll be the moderator for today. Please submit any questions that you have throughout the webinar in the chat, and if you like, you can once again select everyone when you submit your questions, as sometimes the same question is asked twice, and it's also beneficial for others to see what people are asking. Once we're done with the presentation today, we'll answer as many of your questions at the end of the session. And without any further ado, I'd like to now hand over to you, Maximo.
Okay, thank you, Samuel. Welcome, everybody, once again. And as Samuel said, my name is Maximo. I'm an Insights Director with focus in Latin America. I'm actually based in Argentina. And as you can read the title, what I'll be talking is the influence of sporting events on demand. Just a few comments before I start. Few things you'll see. The presentation, it's going to be biased towards my love for sports and the fact that I'm from Argentina and that Argentina won the World Cup a few months ago. So that's what led me to, start writing this presentation. But it's not only about the World Cup; it's just also moving forward and the learnings for the World Cup and what could be applied in the future. So having said that, let's start with. Okay, just before that, a few reminders what's demand. Basically, we pick all the interactions that are in the digital world, not only what consumers are watching, and we also take into account what kind of activity they do. So we put all that together, and that's where the demand metric comes from. As I said before, first I want to get into what I've learned and what we learned about the World Cup. I don't know how many people know about this, but the World Cup is the largest sporting event in the world, and it's basically half the population watches or has interaction with the World Cup every 4 years when it happens. So when it's not crazy to think, or it's not something that it's of course we would know when we start watching a demand and analyzing demand for talents, we could see that of course sports talents demand grew up about 20%, but this was basically because football or soccer players, depending on the country you are, demand grew more than 100%. But if we go specifically into the World Cup players, so those players who actually participated in the World Cup, we can see that their demand grew more than 200%. So when compare the demand 30 days prior to the World Cup, we had that it was about a little bit over 2 times the average. And during that the World Cup, which went from November 20th to December 18th, that demand grew up to 6.5 times the average demand. So we can see that the World Cup had a huge influence in the demand of these talents. If we look a little bit into this, and the interesting part of this is that if we take the top 10 players, football players, which not necessarily all of them participate in the World Cup, out of that top 10, 7 actually played in the World Cup. Their demand, increased significantly. But what is interesting to see, if we take a look, is that for the first time, we see that football players are actually in the top 10. We got 3 players, which is Cristiano Ronaldo, Lionel Messi, and Neymar Jr., that are in the top 10 most in-demand players for that period of time. If we take a look, we have 5 in the top 20, and from different countries, from Portugal, Argentina, 2 from Brazil, and Mbappe from France. And prior to that, we could see that we had no player, not even in the top 20, or only 1 player, which was Ronaldo, he's not active as a player. And interesting is not only how much demand grew for these top players. If you take a look, for example, Luka Modric, who had about 3 times, demand above the average, and now close to 18. But if you can see his ranking, he was, way behind, 1300, in the rank. And when after the World Cup or during the World Cup, his demand positioned him almost within the top 100. So we can see that the World Cup was a huge leverage for the football players. Now, this is what I've been talking recently was worldwide. And so, but we also need to consider the implications locally or regionally. If we take a look, for example, in Argentina, we can see that within the top 20, we have about 8 players that are in the top in the ranking, and top 20 most in demand talents. Being 7 of them being from Argentina, and 6 of them actually haven't played the World Cup. So before that, you can see that only Lionel Messi was within those top 20. The other ones were out of that ranking. And now Lionel Messi, and if we take a look at this today, is the most in-demand not only player, but talent in Argentina. Above talents who usually are above in the rank, like BTS, Elon Musk, or any other musicians or actors that have usually been in the top positions of the ranking. But if you take a look at the right of my screen, and you can see that this did not only happen for Argentina. For example, when Argentina before the World Cup, we only had 1 player within that top 20, and during the World Cup, we have 8. We just take into consideration the 4 finalist teams: Argentina, France, Croatia, and Morocco. We could see that the same trend happened. France had 3 and went up to 6. Croatia had none within the top 20, and then they ended up having 6 local and international players. And same happened with Morocco, which they had a little bit more. They had 4 within the top 20, but at the end of the World Cup, they had 8. So this phenomenon not only happened worldwide, but if you take a look into each country, you can see that the ranking was led by football players. Now, in addition to demand, an interesting thing was also to see if what the opinion and the sentiment those players had during the World Cup and compared to the World Cup. And to me, this is an exceptional complementary metric, because as you can see, you might increase your demand, but not necessarily your sentiment might increase as well. We could say that Lionel Messi and Mbappe, who had both great World Cups, had an epic final game. They had, a very positive, sentiment opinion index. And through the World Cup, and because of the World Cup, that sentiment grew up. Neymar, who had a decent, okay World Cup, basically his sentiment and opinion index remained the same. But then we have Cristiano Ronaldo and Richarlison. Let's start with Richarlison. Maybe not a lot of people of his demand, how many people knew about him wasn't as big, but he had actually a great World Cup. And so not only his demand increased, but the opinion index of him almost doubled. But let's take into consideration at Ronaldo. And, there's always been a huge, it's been a huge talk about Ronaldo. The kind of player that, he generates a lot of buzz. And it's the kind of player that either you love or you hate. There's no in betweens. And that's why his opinion in it is not as high as the other players. But interesting, although as you can see in previous slides, Ronaldo was the most in-demand player during the World Cup. His opinion index dropped. If anybody can remember, he didn't have, it was his last World Cup. Ended up in a little bit of controversy. Started playing, then he was a substitute. So it wasn't the best World Cup for him. And I think that you could see that in the opinion index and the audience sentiment that he had. So not necessarily when demand increases, sentiment will increase too. So it's always good to have this complementary metrics to have the full picture. Now moving forward and analyzing, towards what audience does the World Cup players do have affinity. And here there's kind of a myth. Usually soccer, football is more associated with male. And if you take a look, when you took a look at affinity, you could say that it's true. If you take all the players, they have affinity towards a male audience, 77.5%. When you take a look in terms of generations, it's very, very balanced. So it is something that is crosses all generations. But having said this, the fact that it skews towards a male audience, it's partially true. Because let's, for example, consider the top, top 5 ranked female footballers, and take a look at, where towards which audience they skew. And you would see here that it's actually pretty much balanced. Although some of them still skew towards a male audience, it's probably 50-50. And the top one, Christian Press, actually skews towards a female audience. So the fact that, of course, we still have nowadays more male players than female players, so that's why they skew towards a male audience. It's always good to look into the specifics and try to find those little groups and see if the rule applies. And definitely we can see that here, and when we're talking to female football, that rule doesn't apply. It's a more balanced skew in terms of gender. And this is really, really important, since in October, we're going to have the Females World Cup that it's going to be held in New Zealand. So we should better start taking a little bit, a deeper look into these players and try to see towards which audience they do have an affinity. Now, another thing that it's also interesting, we've been analyzing the World Cup impact as a whole, but start analyzing individually each players and how its demand evolved during the World Cup, and across the globe. So this is what I call the Messi effect. And in terms of, I'm from Argentina. Messi, it's very known person, but probably worldwide, that knowledge of him it's not equal. And you can see that Messi was able to increase his demand, all across the regions and across the globe, significantly. Of course, North America, South America, and even Europe, which are countries that regions that he's most known, it could make sense. But seeing that he, for example, in Asia or places like Oceania, his demand grew, 300 and 500%. That's amazing. I'm trying to see, how this person actually, used the World Cup for his, demand to improve. And if we take a look at Messi today, it's not that his demand, definitely he's not having this amount of demand as he did during the World Cup, but his demand, he's actually the #1 athlete in terms of demand. And he's, he has consolidated himself within the top 20 of, among all talents. So this is an example of how one event can actually leverage the demand of one player and position him worldwide. Now, one could argue that the World Cup is unique, and and Messi is unique. So it's no brainer that his demand actually grew. But what is interesting to see, and in these slides, you can see actually two things. Not only to see how his demand increased during the World Cup, and you can see here's the World Cup kickoff, and this peaks right here is actually the final game. So of course he ranked number one and had a peak demand which was almost 280 times, above the average. But you can see that he also ranked, high, and his demand peaked in countries like the United States, Nigeria, Bangladesh, India, which usually are markets that you wouldn't think that are, more related to football or related to a South American player. And he was able to be in that day the number one, the most in demand, not only athlete but talent in the world and in these markets. But if you take a comparison, and let's do an analogy with what happened during the 2019 World Cup that was actually played in France. And let's take the, Megan Rapinoe, who was, a U.S. soccer player. The U.S. very big in football or soccer among women, who actually won the World Cup that year. And you can see that the same trend happened to her. Her demand wasn't as big as Messi, but as she continued and as the U.S. continued to advance to the finals, you can see how she demand increased, not only in her home market, United States, but in markets like France, Germany, India, Pakistan. So she was having global coverage. So yes, the World Cup is unique, but we can also say that every other sports or venue is unique and has a lot of influence in talents. Another thing that is interesting to see, and what happened is how to link demand with brands and try to find which are the most suitable brands for a player. And here, once again, I'm using an example of an Argentine player, not Messi, because when I was thinking about this, Messi, Cristiano Ronaldo, Mbappe, that those are safe bets. But of course, not everybody has the budget to, do or invest, or a brand to invest in those kind of players, because they're the top players, not only of their country, but in the world. So this is an example of, Mostaza, which is a local food chain from Argentina, who actually invested in Emiliano Dibu Martinez, who's the goalkeeper, Argentina's goalkeeper, who had a huge World Cup. He's famous because of him. Big influence in winning against the Netherlands and in France in PKs. And he was actually named the best goalkeeper of the World Cup. So Mostaza decided to invest in him. And as you can see, his demand in Argentina when the World Cup started and when the World Cup ended, increased almost 10 times. So, being able to identify this kind of players and to which brands they have affinity, and making that, taking that risk, but it's a known risk, and minimizing that risk and being able to see, hey, which are the second or third tier players that we should be looking, and to which brands they have affinity. That's something that can actually work out. And it did work out for Mostaza, who actually invested. And just a couple, things that happened. For example, their campaign in YouTube had about, the previous campaign had, 220,000 views, and the campaign that they run during the World Cup, by mid-World Cup, it already had 200,000 views. So it had 10 times more views than the prior campaign. So being able to identify, those key players and towards which brands they have an affinity, it's key for success. And you can see that, for example, Diego Martinez has, a lot of affinity, not only with Mostaza, but with airlines, Flybondi, Aerolíneas Argentina, and also with the entertainment industry, like Star Plus, La Voz, which is an Argentine, The Voice, it's the Argentine version of The Voice, and some Quilmes, which is a beer brand. Now, until now, I have been talking about how demand and the World Cup had an influence on talent demand. But not only the World Cup can only have demand on talents, but I think it also has demand on content. And for this, I'm using the case study of El Gerente, the manager, which was an Argentine movie that was released about a month prior to the World Cup. Just to give you a little context about this movie and why it was so relevant. The Manager, it's a movie that actually, it's a true story about how a marketing manager of appliance company here in Argentina did a promotion for the 2018 World Cup. It was during the qualifiers, and basically what it said, if Argentina didn't qualify to the World Cup, everybody who bought a smart TV, 50-inch smart TV, would get reimbursed the full amount of the TV. The interesting thing is that this campaign was launched about 4 or 5 games prior to the end of the qualifiers, which the risk of Argentina not qualifying was low. But what happened was that Argentina didn't win a few key games and actually was able to qualify on the very last game, playing against Ecuador in Ecuador, and started losing that game within 10 minutes of that game. We were losing 1-0. Argentina ended up winning that game and qualified to that, but the marketing campaign kept going, and based on that, this was a case study, and they actually made a movie out of this. So although it wasn't related to the 2022 World Cup, it was related to the World Cup and to Argentina. So the movie, when it was released, it had an average demand, 1.5 above average, which was okay, wasn't a huge success. But as Argentina started playing the World Cup, people started to relate between, with this movie, and demand during the World Cup, rise to four times, the average demand, with a peak demand that it was 10 times above the average demand. And because of this, during the World Cup, El Gerente, the manager, reached, on December, almost made it into the top 10 most in demand movies in Argentina. So, and if we can take a look at the evolution on a day-to-day basis, what we can see is like prior to the opening game, demand was 1.4 times above demand. When the World Cup started, that demand grew 2 times, 2.5 times that average demand. And then after some key games, I don't know if you remember, but Argentina actually lost their first game, and we almost were knocked out of the initial round. And then, so when Argentina had to play Mexico and we beat Mexico, this had a huge leverage on the movie. And then after playing the Netherlands, that's when it reached its peak, which was about 5 times the average demand that it had prior to the World Cup. So as you can see, these kind of sporting events not only have influence on talents, but also have influence on content. Now, that's it for the World Cup right now, because this is all in the past. And although as an Argentine, we'll keep, celebrating the World Cup, we need to move forward and start looking ahead. So beyond the World Cup, I want to use the example of the Formula One, which is an event that actually happens every year, and it starts in March and it ends by October, November. And as you can see, this is when we take a look at the Formula One, because we are able to track some sports, being the Formula One one of them. you can see that it has an average demand 26 or almost 27 times above the average, and had a peak demand 60 times. So it has an outstanding demand. And when you take a look globally, it has a demand in almost every country. It has a good demand above. So it's a very diverse event that it has a, it tracks not only in the US or Europe, but all across the regions, APAC, Latin America, the US, Europe, and even in Africa. Now, when we take a look at the talents that take place and that participate, which are the racers, we can see that there's a demand, and it's impressive if we compare the demand to the World Cup. It's like if we take a look all the 2022, but you would see how their demand peaked after every race. So we have about 20 races in the calendar. So every other 2 weeks, 3 weeks, we would see how the demand of these racers would actually peak. But interesting to the levels of the demand that actually the World Cup had. So yeah, the World Cup was unique, but then we have year-round events that are also unique and have great demand. And even in the off season, you can see that the demand for the racers is pretty high, actually above the World Cup players. Now, being able, and why the Formula One and being able to track the demand for the talents is so important, because this gives space to see and have a huge correlation with related content. So if we take a look at the demand for the Formula One, we can see very high demand with peaks usually after every race, but it's important because that gives space to create content that is related. And here we got Formula One Drive to Survive, which is a documentary based on the Formula One. And you can see that given the high demand that the Formula One has and that their talents have, Netflix was able to launch and recreate a TV show related to this with a huge success. Now wrapping up, trying to understand why this is important and why we need to focus on and try to find global, regional, or local opportunities. And I want to use the example of the when we take a look at the most in-demand athletes worldwide during 2023, Lionel Messi, Cristiano Ronaldo on the top two. Okay, makes sense. But then the next four are actually for cricket players. And for me, this is a huge surprise. Here in Argentina, and I would say probably in Latin America, cricket, it's very little known. But when I saw this, and I actually learned a little bit, and I found out that also in October, we're going to have the Cricket World Cup. And that's the third largest event worldwide after the World Cup and Olympics. And although it cannot, maybe cannot be considered like a global event, it is a regional event with the implication of a global event, because you got countries like India who are playing, which basically account for 1/3 of the population. So being able to see these, regional opportunities and try to identify, which are the talents or which are the shows that are, and being able to do that in advance would be key, for future references, and try to promote and try to find those brands that are actually have affinity with the content and with the players. And what is also really interesting and why this is important is when we take a look at the supply and the demand for sports related content over the past 5 years, we can see that both of them have more than doubled. So it's not only that people are, we have content producers who are actually producing more sport related content, but at the same time, we have audiences that are actually demanding this kind of content. And that's why this is really, really important. So to wrap it up and try to see what are the opportunities coming up ahead, we do have, like, for example, like this, not to the size of the World Cup, but in the next 2 years, we do have, like, for example, in terms of football, we got the Euro Cup being played next year. We got the Olympics, which is the second largest event worldwide, that it's also going to be held next year. We got the Copa America. We got the basketball World Cup, the cricket World Cup, and the rugby World Cup, which is also very, very big and had a lot, has a lot of leverage in countries like New Zealand, Australia, South Africa, and even in countries like Argentina. But we don't have to wait 4 years or 2 or 3 years for this kind of events to happen. Every year, we do have a tremendous amount of sports and tournaments and leagues, but not only related to football. We got the Formula One, we just saw. We got cycling with the Tour of France. We got golf. We got tennis. We got rugby. We got even local sports like the Super Bowl or American football, baseball. We got volleyball, which is it's very big in countries like Brazil, Russia, and so being able to identify all of these tournaments, all these sports, identify the talents, identify which brands have which towards they have affinity, and also being able to identify which related content we have to promote that would be key for success. So having said that, I hope you like the presentation, and any questions you have, more than happy to answer.
Great. Thank you, Maximo. There haven't been too many questions submitted today. Usually we get a whole bunch, but looks like your presentation was all 100% clear. No one had any questions, and that's okay. So you can just go ahead and if you like, answer any questions that were submitted ahead of time. Over to you.
Sure. Let me pull those up. Great. I do have them right with me. Can't find them right now. There was one question in terms of understanding how talent demand works. And basically talent demand works the same as TV or movie demand. Basically we track all the interactions that are going around, the digital world, with the only difference that the open streaming is not one of the verticals that we track, because, it's based on, on talents, not on content. But then again, it's like we focus on that. So it's pretty much like TV demand and movie demand, and then the metric, it's the same.
Makes sense. I put a Help Center article on that in the chat as well for those people that want a little bit more information on the methodology.
Let me see, because right now, for some reason, I cannot find the questions. But let me see if I can find them right now. Now, there's another one that, in terms of what are the growing sports and leagues in terms of demand. This is something that we do track some sports, not all sports. It's along a roadmap to start having this, tracking this. We do track sports related, content related. But what we're seeing is that I would say this is maybe a tricky question, because as I said before, it's important to try to regionalize what's trending in each country, in each region. If you would ask me, for example, cricket would never be on my mind because I'm from Argentina. And to me, it's not a sport that it's actually being played here. But it is definitely, it is, you know, I wouldn't say a growing sport, but it's in terms of demand, in terms of the talents, you can see that it's very relevant. You know, having four talents in the top 10 most in-demand athletes. Basketball also has a lot of influence. And also the other thing, it depends on what, the period of time. For example, once again, if you take a look at the Super Bowl, you take a look at January when the Super Bowl, February when the Super Bowl is played, you can see that actually demand, spikes for certain athletes. So it's not about which sports are growing. It's about, trying to see, when that sport is being played and the influence. Because of, as I said, based on what I've seen on the 2019 Females World Cup, definitely we'll see that there's going to be a lot of demand for women's soccer during October when the World Cup is being played. Then the other one, do fans follow the athletes or teams? We do focus on athletes. So what we track is the demand for different athletes. And as we can see, for example, when we saw about the World Cup, we could see that the focus was on the athletes, because you could see that like 7 players from Argentina being the top 20, most in demand talents. And so it's not only, of course, Argentina plays, but also you can take a look and see which players, and because of the performance, how they actually perform. So it's always about, at the end of the day, the athletes are the ones who show that demand. And after those events are over, you can keep tracking the demand for those talents and try to see, as I said, Messi, for example, who had, high demand, but after the World Cup, his demand keep high up there, while the demand of other teammates may have dropped a little bit more after the World Cup. Any other questions?
No, I think we're all good. We'll close it off here. Thank you, Maximo. There was a very insightful and informative session. Please reach out to us with any further questions that you may have. The easiest way to do that is to reply to the email that we will send out to you in the next 24 hours with the webinar recording and the presentation. Thank you again, all of you, for joining us here today, and we will see you at the next Parrot Analytics Live. Thank you and have a great day.
Thank you.